Hello and welcome to another video review. This is The Walking Dead Season 1 for numerous systems, but what you're seeing here is the PC version. This is an episodic adventure game by Telltale Games that was released throughout the year of 2012, starting with PC, Mac, PS3, and Xbox 360, and later ported to a couple of other systems as well, including the next-gen consoles, PS Vita, stuff like that. Now I have to mention that I'm going to try to avoid spoilers as much as I possibly can, but it's going to be difficult because this is an extremely story and character driven game that is extremely linear. So I'm, again, trying to avoid spoilers as much as I can, but I just can't necessarily do that all the time. So what I'm having to do is take most of the footage you're going to see from the very, very early episodes, and if anything is worth mentioning when it comes to the main plot or the gameplay, or I need to point anything out, then I'm going to take clips from wherever I need to take them. So I apologize in advance for the lack of variety in the footage, but it's for a good reason. At any rate, the real question here is, how is this game? Because, let's face it, the amount of hype this thing has is ridiculous. It got tons of awards, including lots of Game of the Year awards when it came out. And it was considered just this high mark of video game storytelling. The plot was considered amazing, and I can't think of the number of people I've heard go, "Oh, it was so emotional, and I was crying," and stuff like that. Honestly, I don't know how I managed to avoid spoilers as long as I did. I didn't get any spoilers for this game at all. I went into this thing with a completely fresh perspective. At least apart from my normal bias against zombie games, but that's because there's so damn many of them, and it drives me crazy to see that everything has to be zombies these days. So, apart from that, how is this thing? Does it really live up to the hype? Is it really one of the best examples of video game storytelling that exists? Is it really deserving of the massive amount of praise that it got? Let's find out. Well, as far as the presentation goes, it's a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, you have an art style that's really in line with something like a comic book, which makes sense given the source material. But at the same time, if you don't like that kind of art, you're not going to get anything out of the art in this game. And it really does fall to the art style's charm to bring its visuals up, even though there's not a huge amount of charm to the style. And the simple reason for that is, honestly, the visuals are really unimpressive in this game. It's not that they're bad, they're okay, but you've got a lot of really low-res textures, you've got some modeling that's often kind of jagged, you've got animations that are really undetailed, well, apart from facial animations anyway, but if you're just walking around or running or the people are fighting zombies or whatever's going on, usually the animations are kind of jagged and janky, and oftentimes you'll find that there's just blatant jump cuts where an animation was not synced to the next frame, and so people will just pop in out of nowhere seemingly, or they'll jump forward several feet, and so on and so forth. It actually gets kind of annoying and almost breaks the immersion sometimes when you just see someone walking along and then suddenly they're about 2 yards ahead of where they were in an instant cut without the angle changing. So, things get kind of awkward like that sometimes. But by and large, they have put a decent amount of detail into everything. The environments are packed with various things that actually make them seem kind of legit. The problem being you can't really interact with much of it, but still, the interface is pretty clean and usable, so they certainly deserve props for that. And likewise, they deserve props for the sound design, except for one notable instance. The voice acting is really mixed. Some of them are really, really well voiced. Some of them aren't so well voiced. Some of them who are not so well voiced just end up coming across as very cheesy or amateurish, and those that are very well voiced actually you can kinda get attached to, because the game is trying to establish emotional connections with the player, and having a very, very well-equipped voice cast is kind of essential for that. And so when you got these characters who just come across as flat or as just these almost corny caricatures, it kind of takes you out of the experience. But at the same time, the principal characters are pretty well voiced. And so that's kind of what'll keep you going there. The music is honestly nothing worth writing home about either. It's about what you would expect from a zombie survival kind of situation. Lots of somber tones and such like that. You've heard it before. It works for the game, but at the same time, it just feels kind of uninspired. But obviously what really matter here are the story and to a much, much lesser extent the gameplay. You play as Lee Everett, who is a former teacher and now convicted murderer who at the very beginning of the game is on his way to prison in Georgia and ends up running afoul of the zombie apocalypse, which just suddenly comes out of nowhere. Obviously, the story that ensues after that is basically one of survival, and along the way he runs into a girl named Clementine, and he takes it upon himself to look after her as a sort of guardian, and that's the real main story of this game, the relationship between Lee and Clementine, and how they just grow over time. Along the way they run into a bunch of other survivors and eventually form a group, and that's where I kind of want to end the discussion of the plot, because from there on stuff gets pretty story heavy. And here's where one of the major problems of this thing comes into play. You pretty much know from the very beginning exactly what is going to happen throughout the entirety of the season. Why? Well, if you've read the Walking Dead comics, which I have not, or watched the show, which I have not, then you pretty much know exactly how those go. But if you know anything about zombie survival stories, you know that there can only be a few things that they can do with them. And one of them, which is what Telltale decided to do, is to focus on character development through all of these characters growing in their relationships over time, as well as having to put up with all of these extremely hard decisions that they have to make in order to survive. And of course looking at all the effects that those are going to have on their psyches and such. The problem with that being, it makes the game extremely predictable to the point where I could make predictions in episode 1 for the end of the season, and they would ring true. I could go into any episode, predict almost exactly what is going to happen, without knowing anything about the game. Not a thing. The only thing I knew going into this was that it received a massive amount of acclaim, that it's a zombie survival story, and that you play as a guy named Lee Everett. That's it. That is literally all I knew going into this thing, and yet I was able to predict almost every single thing that happened in the game. Almost exactly as it happened, in fact. And I just was left going, well, this is disappointing. Now that's not to say that the writing in this game is bad. It's not. In fact, it's really good for what it is. But the problem is, it's a zombie survival story. We've seen it all before. There's nothing original you can do with a zombie plot at this point. And I feel like Telltale deserves a lot of credit for what they did, which was to deliver really, really good writing despite being extremely predictable and just having the been there, done that mentality. Because let's face it, zombies are so ubiquitous at this point that we've literally seen everything there is to see with zombies. And yet, the game still managed to deliver compelling characters with surprisingly interesting situations that played out pretty well. Now there were certain parts of the game where I felt like it was trying to go for cheap shots or things like that. But by and large, it works pretty well. Stuff builds up and it makes sense when things go horribly wrong, which, let's face it, it's a zombie survival story. That's not a spoiler. You know bad things are going to happen. And when they do in this game, they actually make sense and they work pretty well. Which, again, to be commended. But where this thing really does fall apart is the gameplay. You see, they do two things in particular. The first of them is that the gameplay is minimal. Now what I mean by that is that there's only a couple of things you're going to be doing throughout the entire game. The first of them is walking around, very slowly, and finding items that you can use. And there's not really much thought put into the puzzles here. It's basically just use item that you found 5 seconds ago on thing that you saw but couldn't do anything with. Whoa. And even on the things that would require the slightest bit of logic that really anyone could do, the game basically spells everything out for you. For example, there's one particular part of the game, which, again, this isn't really much of a spoiler, it's just a puzzle that's really not much of a puzzle. The idea is that you need to get some directions in order to fiddle with some switches and such. Unfortunately, the notepad that had the instructions on it has had its page torn off, and so you don't have access to the instructions. Or do you? Hey, there's some indentations in the notepad where the person had written the instructions. Gee, I wonder what we need to do. Is there a pencil around here somewhere? This is the kind of stuff you would do in grade school. And not very high-level grade school either. So, the problem with the puzzles is anyone can do them, and the game spells everything out for you. There's only a handful of things you can interact with in any given situation, and it's pretty painfully obvious what to do. So, the gameplay ends up being very uncompelling from a puzzle standpoint, which makes it not a particularly great adventure game. And then there's the rest of the game, where you're probably going to be doing QuickTime events. Lots of them. Or you're going to be mashing Q a lot, and then following it up by pressing E. See, the game relies way too much on situations where it decides to throw some QuickTime events right in your face, which is never compelling gameplay. It has never been good in any game that it's ever been in, and this one is no exception. It just gets annoying when all of a sudden you have to start mashing Q because a zombie grabbed you, and thus you have to just mash Q because I guess that's what causes you to shake them off or something. And it just gets annoying. It's not compelling gameplay. It doesn't do anything to actually help tell the plot. And speaking of not really being conducive to the plot, there's other segments where it just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense why they did certain things with regards to the gameplay. For example, when they give you the task of beating a zombie's head in. Well, you're gonna beat the zombie's head in, you know exactly what happens, you know exactly how it's going to affect the character. Why does it make you hit multiple times? I guess to emphasize the finality of the act, but it's really not that effective. And it actually just kind of gets annoying and drags the game out. There's other segments that are kind of like that too, where you'll just be walking down a hallway or something and nothing will happen. And it doesn't draw tension or anything like that. There's really no tension at all in that particular situation. But then you just walk up to a person and it's like, oh, let's have a conversation. And it's perfectly pleasant conversation. So what was the point of walking? I guess it was just because they wanted to have an interruption in cutscenes so the player wasn't just sitting there staring at them for too long. You see, this thing is so reliant on its story and its character development that it kinda loses track of being a game. It's really more of an interactive movie than anything else. Or I guess in this case it's really more of an interactive TV series to some degree. And it's not really one of its strengths. If I wasn't as comfortable with low interaction games as I am, this would have done absolutely nothing at all for me. For people who play games for the gameplay, this is going to do nothing for them. There's not much gameplay at all here, if really any. It does have choices that you can make, and those do have some impact on the way things turn out, which is certainly nice, but ultimately the game has an all roads lead to Rome feel. Like, your choices don't necessarily matter as much as you think they might. And while they do influence the way things turn out, some things you just can't avoid. That makes sense, and they actually handled that idea fairly well in this thing. You can't save everyone. They make that very abundantly clear. It's a zombie apocalypse. Stuff's gonna happen. You know it, and you just have to deal with it. And so they did a good job with that, but at the same time, they managed to make it feel like the choices were not completely arbitrary, because the way you do things actually does influence how people see you and how people react to you. It may be somewhat subtle, but you do notice it. And some of the consequences to your actions are very, very unpleasant, because you have to make hard decisions when trying to survive in a zombie apocalypse. So, at least they had that going for it. But overall, I can't help but feel like this game is extremely disappointing. That's what happens when you have a game as hyped up as this is. No matter how good it actually is, it's never going to live up to the hype. I still managed to come away from this thing pleasantly surprised in the fact that I managed to actually get something out of a zombie game, but the very, very lackluster gameplay and the extremely predictable plot, despite how well it's written, just bring it down. It's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. Don't get that idea in your head. But it's really not the mind-bogglingly amazing, emotional experience that people make it out to be. Unless maybe you have never, ever seen a zombie movie, or read anything about zombies, or played a zombie game in your life. But for everybody else, this is pretty much just a really niche game. If you like zombies, you'll probably enjoy this. If you like The Walking Dead, you'll probably love this. But if you're like me and you can't stand the obsession with zombies, you're not really going to get much out of this thing. Ultimately though, I really can't give this thing anything higher than a 3.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.